And now we dive into today's discussion with a special guest, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub. We're going to be discussing, inshallah, the issue of inflation and in rising inequality in the United States. What's the cause of it? What can be done about it? What shouldn't be done about it? We're very happy to discuss those issues with Dr. Kaboub. Let's bring him on. You all know him. He's been a guest on the program numerous times. He's a professor of economics at Denison, and he serves as president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Kaboub. How are you?
Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me back on the show. I'm doing great.
No, thank you for coming back, mashallah. So let's dive in. There's a new CBO report that gave us some indication of the difficulties the American people continue to face economically and in terms of inequality. Can you tell us about the CBO report and what it showed?
Well, in a way, it is shocking, but not surprising, because we've seen this trend build up for the last couple of decades. And what the CBO is showing in this report is that while wealth has tripled in the last decades on average for American families, the distribution of that wealth has been massively unequal, in the sense that the bottom 50% of the population in the US is only accumulating 2% of the national wealth, where we also have the top 1% of the wealth distribution essentially controlling a third of the wealth of the nation. That is a level of inequality that we haven't seen in the US before. And that basically tells us that we fundamentally, from a structural perspective, we have an economic engine that automatically distributes more wealth to the top. And what we should be doing is, instead of keeping the same engine that produces inequality, produces socioeconomic exclusion, and then wondering how we're going to redistribute this unequal situation back into something more reasonable, because redistribution is very difficult, if you haven't noticed, politically. Instead of doing this, what we need to be doing is completely changing the engine altogether and replacing it with an engine that does the right kind of pre-distribution instead of fighting in a system of redistribution. And that's really the biggest economic challenge and political challenge that we face in this country. And that's a problem of governance, a problem of democracy, fundamentally.
So, Dr. Kaboub, then what does the solution look like? Because obviously this has been, the debate of the 20th century was, what is the proper economic model for a country, a government to follow? And there were literally wars fought about this for decades. There'd be socialists, communists, capitalists, somewhere in between. What to your mind then is the ideal engine that would lead to more equality, and obviously not complete economic equality, that's possible in the world, but less inequality? What does that engine look like?
Well, we have the blueprint for the economic model, and it starts from the Constitution, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So, and when it comes to regulating the economic system, because economic policy is made up of a legal framework that's created by the 535 lawmakers that we elect in Washington, D.C. And setting up that legal framework allows us to design the right way of pre-distributing wealth. In the current system, we have a political system that's heavily influenced by big pharma, by Wall Street, by the multinational corporations that suck wealth from the nation, from the working class, and from the rest of the world, to be honest. So we have to have the political courage to redesign public policy in a way that's more fair and equitable and inclusive. And that's really fundamentally a question of democracy. It's not a question of socialism versus capitalism versus any kind of other ism. It's a question of using the foundation that we have in the Constitution and designing a legal framework that allows people to thrive as workers, as citizens, as opposed to setting up a system that allows for the formation of monopolies and cartels and oligopolies. Our antitrust laws, for example, are outdated. They're more than 100 years old. And they were not written and designed for a world of big pharma, of super PACs, a world of Silicon Valley big tech companies, and we haven't had the political courage to rethink the way we write the laws of the land when it comes to corporate power in this country.
Interesting. So it sounds like what I'm hearing from you, Dr. Wu, is that we've got so much political power concentrated in the hands of major giant corporations that eat up other corporations whenever they have a good idea. And so strengthening antitrust laws, you think, might be one way to increase competition and separate and divide up that power. And so you don't have corporations, giant corporations, wielding so much power and influence over our political system and over tax breaks and other such things. Let me ask you this. So we've got the inflation situation that's going on. Since I last spoke to you, are things actually getting better, leveling off? What's the situation with inflation? Because my understanding is that also is something that harms quote unquote working class people more immediately and more directly than necessarily people who have more wealth stored up.
Well, the inflation situation is obviously hasn't been resolved in the U.S. or globally, and it's specifically because the inflation pressure points that we're dealing with have persisted. Their root causes have persisted, and we're not tackling the root causes. For example, when it comes to the actual inflation pressure points in the US, we had inflation pressure points that have existed for the last 2 or 3 decades, pre-COVID, pre the conflict in the Ukraine. And then we added on top of it the supply chain disruptions related to the global COVID pandemic that added to, shipping delays and manufacturing delays and shortages of components and things like that, and the big traffic jam in the oceans for shipping components. That adds inflation. And then, of course, with the conflict in the Ukraine, we have 2 additional major pressure points related to food and energy prices globally, and also prices of raw materials from Russia, minerals and things like that are very critical for manufacturing globally. And that just increases commodity prices across the board. So all of these inflation pressure points still persist, and there's no reason to believe that they're going to go away, magically when the Federal Reserve Bank decides to raise interest rates. So raising interest rates here by the Federal Reserve Bank will not find a diplomatic solution to the conflict in the Ukraine. So it's not going to tame that inflation pressure point. It's not going to undo the logistical delays and the supply chain disruptions that we have for the last 2 years related to COVID. Raising interest rate doesn't solve that. It's way outside the jurisdiction of the Fed. And then the earlier pre-existing inflation pressure points that we had in the US before 2020 are from 4 major areas. 1 is healthcare, 2 is higher education, 3 is energy and transportation, and 4 is real estate and housing. And again, the Fed raising interest rates is not going to give us a different healthcare system or tame the abusive market power of big pharma, of health insurance companies, or solve the student debt crisis. A lot of these inflation pressure points are long-term, structural, and they're actually in the jurisdiction of Congress rather than the Federal Reserve Bank. But instead, when the Fed raises interest rate, because they think that's the only policy tool that is available to the country, when they raise interest rate, they increase the cost of doing business. In other words, they slow down the economy. They actually cause unemployment. And the Fed has been pretty honest the last few weeks, saying that they're willing to cause a recession if they have to. Because when they cause a recession, unemployed people can't buy additional goods and services. So that reduces the demand and allows the supply to catch up a little bit. And that literally translates into throwing some people under the bus, the most vulnerable people under the bus, in order to fight inflation with interest rates, instead of doing the right thing, which is addressing the underlying causes of inflation.
Well, you answered my next question, which is going to be, could the Fed end up causing harm through what they're doing? I think you've answered that question. Of course, as Muslims know, there's all this jurisprudence about why interest rates on debt are bad and riba and all that stuff. And so you can kind of see this manifested in real life through this financial experiment that keeps happening over and over again. So it sounds like what you're saying is, look, the inflation problem, a lot of that is just a result of current events, right, that are not going to be fixed overnight, number one. In the meantime, what the Fed is doing could create more problems than it solves. And in the meantime, Congress is not getting anything done. So this is all, it seems like this is all bad news all around, So what can be done in the short term, do you think? I mean, even if it's on an individual family level, what is there anything positive that anyone can do to try to address these issues in the short term while Ukraine, or Russia's at war with Ukraine. The Fed is doing what it's doing. Congress is not doing anything. Is there anything anyone can do, or should we just be raising our voices, saying you've got to make structural change to address these problems?
Well, believe it or not, in the midst of all of this mess and all of this negative kind of context that I provided, there is actually a glimmer of hope, even from Congress, from President Biden, because when you think of what the Inflation Reduction Act was about, when you think of the partial student debt cancellation was about, these are actually anti-inflation policies. Notice that the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, part of it was going after the abusive market power of corporations, including pharmaceuticals. So the government will be negotiating at least the prices of 20-some major drugs to lower the cost. That is part of going after the abusive market power of big pharma. The Inflation Reduction Act, believe it or not, includes strategic spending on renewable energy infrastructure to encourage the production and use of electric vehicles here in the US. That is good news because it increases job creation and it allows us to wean the economy off of fossil fuels and off of one of the sources of inflation, which is fossil fuel prices, global energy prices. But we're doing it a little too late and on a much, much smaller scale. So one of the things we can do as a country, as informed citizens, is call for more of the above, more student debt cancellation, more taxing and regulation of abusive market power, democratizing the economy, and more strategic investments that will tame these sources of abusive market power and sources of inflation related to fossil fuels, healthcare costs, and so on. We've done a little bit of it under the Inflation Reduction Act and the student debt partial debt cancellation, but we should be doing way more on a more sustained basis. As individual consumers, we need to be, and as members of a democratic society, especially the media, we need to be calling out corporations who are actually taking advantage of the COVID crisis, taking advantage of the inflation crisis, taking advantage of the conflict in the Ukraine, and blaming everything on these global events in order to raise their prices, not just to cover the cost of doing business, but they're doing above and beyond covering the cost of doing business. They're actually widening their profit margins and reporting record prices, and they're actually speaking about it publicly. When you listen to the shareholder conference calls that the CEOs and CFOs are actually announcing this publicly. They're saying the pricing environment is favorable, we're able to raise prices, and nobody's complaining, not the government, not the public, so we're going to go ahead and widen our profit margins. These are the kinds of things that we need to engage with directly, and that affects us immediately in terms of our budget, in terms of grocery costs and cost of health and transportation. All of these things affect us.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much, Professor. We appreciate that perspective and insight, and we look forward to having you back in the future, God willing, to hopefully discuss some more positive economic news, inshallah. Thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.